Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. My name is Markus and in my last video we talked about HDR in The Witcher 3 on the consoles, and today we're talking about the PC version. And if you watched my last video about the console version, I was happy, I was very surprised about HDR after the next gen update, because the quality of HDR in The Witcher 3 is really outstanding in my opinion. I'm not even talking about the specular highlights, because I told you already in my video that I have seen better specular highlights in terms of details, but we're getting something in this game what we haven't seen lately. And I'm talking about great contrast in HDR, because yeah, I don't know if you remember the Callisto Protocol, great game, and unfortunately very bad black level rays. So, and it is destroying the whole HDR experience in my opinion. But here we're getting great contrast in HDR on the console and, spoiler alert, also on the PC version. But it gets even better, because on the PC version we have actually the possibility to change HDR a little bit. But don't get too excited, because we don't have, or we still don't have, proper HDR settings in The Witcher 3 on the PC. It's actually exactly the same as on the console. We don't support the HDR system level calibration under Windows 11, and yeah, the only setting what we have in terms of, let's say like this display setting, is the gamma setting, and yeah, there's no difference to the console version at all. But on the PC version we have a config file. And the file we are looking for, you can find it under Documents, The Witcher 3, and it is called dx12user.settings. But before you now open this file with a notepad or something else, please do me the favor and save a copy of the file, because if you change something by accident, you can actually ruin your whole game. And when you have done this, you can open up the file, and we are looking for the headline visuals. And what you can see here, we have a couple of entries like HDR Paperwhite, we have HDR Gamma, we have Gamma Value, and also we have the maximum TV brightness. But what I can tell you right now, forget about maximum TV brightness, forget about the HDR Gamma setting. The only setting what is really working, or the only setting what is working, is the HDR Paperwhite setting. And of course I played with all the different values in this setting, especially with the visual setting, and I found that there is no difference at all when I'm changing the HDR Gamma 2 setting or the HDR Gamma 1 setting, and also not when I'm changing the maximum TV brightness setting. And this is actually a little bit of a disappointment, because I was hoping that the maximum TV brightness setting will limit the maximum peak brightness in the game in terms of HDR, but unfortunately it is not working at all. So even I change this to 100, there is the exact same maximum peak brightness output in the game. And the same counts for the HDR Gamma 2 and the HDR Gamma 1 setting. I changed it like crazy, but there is no difference in the game at all. And the only two entries where I can see a difference in terms of picture HDR brightness is HDR Paperwhite and the Gamma Value. But Gamma Value is exactly the same setting what you have in the game, so there's no point to change this value in the config file. So the only remaining entry is actually HDR Paperwhite. And the standard setting in HDR Paperwhite, when you open up the config file for the very first time, is set to 300. And I have to say they did actually a really good job, because the whole picture with the standard setting in HDR looks fantastic on the PC, the same as on the console. So again, I really think they did a great job with implementing HDR in this game. But because you can change the HDR Paperwhite setting in the config file, we can make HDR a little bit better on our TV. But again, there is no must to do so, because the out-of-the-box experience in HDR in The Witcher 3 on the console or on the PC is just awesome. But now let's talk about my recommended settings, because that's why you're here for. But before we do this, please do me a big favor, like, share and subscribe. Thank you. Okay my friends, so let's take a closer look on my recommended settings for The Witcher 3 on the PC for the LG CX C1, C2 G1 and also the G2 S95B and A95K. Please always keep in mind, I just own the LG CX and the LG G2. All the other TVs are recommendations, but because they are very close to each other, I think my recommended settings will fit them also. And the only setting what you need to change in the config file is the HDR paper white setting. And I told you already, the standard setting is 300, which fits actually really perfect. But I found you should increase this a little bit when you like to use HDR. So for an example, on the LG CX, C1, C2 or G1, or on TVs with a maximum peak brightness of around 700, 800 candela or nits, I would actually recommend to increase this from 300 to 350. And when I played this game on my LG G2 with HGig enabled, I found HDR paper white set to 400. Fits perfect. But now let's talk about dynamic tone mapping on, which you can use if you prefer a little bit of a brighter picture, but then I would not increase the HDR paper white setting too much, because what I found is the standard setting or standard value 300 is actually really nice with dynamic tone mapping on, at least on my LG CX and the G2. In terms of the HDR paper white setting for the S95B or A95K, it is really up to you, because you need to try a couple of settings what you like better, because the problem is the S95B, for an example, is tone mapping the whole time, even you use the HDR option on the TV. And that means that maybe a HDR paper white setting of 400 is already a little bit too much for the S95B, but please do me a favor, try it and put the value what you think is the best for the S95B in the comment section, and then we can share it. So let's talk about the gamma value, and I told you already there is no need to change this in the config file, because you have the exact same setting in the game and it is so easy to change this value, and the graphic or the test screen or the test pattern is actually working as it should be. And the standard factory setting when you start the game for the very first time is that, and the gamma value in the config file is 1 standard factory setting, but I highly recommend actually to decrease this a little bit to get a higher contrast. For HDR I actually recommend 0.9 or that. And for dynamic tone mapping on, I recommend a value of 0.76 or like that. But at the end, all what you have to do is follow the instruction and set this up according to your environment. If you play in a very bright environment, make sure you set this up in a bright environment. And on the other hand, if you play in a complete dark room, make sure it is really complete dark when you set this up. If you now play in dynamic tone mapping on or HGig or dynamic tone mapping off, at the end it's really up to you what you like best. I personally found HDR, even there's not a official support, I mean, we talked about this, not a single game supports HDR, but you get my point. There's no HDR system level calibration support, not on the consoles, not on the PC. Therefore, HDR is probably not really to recommend, but it's quite the opposite, because it is working quite well in my opinion. But as always, dynamic tone mapping on can deliver a higher average picture brightness if you like that. But then keep in mind to change the HDR paper white setting accordingly. The only thing what I can't recommend, as always, is dynamic tone mapping off. And I'm not quite sure if you can actually see this on your screen at the moment what's going on here, but we have a sunset and a sunrise. It just looks amazing. I love it, and that's why I haven't played that much, because most of the time when I'm starting playing the game, I'm actually ending up with watching stuff like this, you know, and it's just amazing. The whole design, or the design from the game in terms of graphic, atmosphere, this all works just perfectly together in my opinion. And now with HDR support, we have this great contrast. I can't just repeat myself. One of the best contrast in an HDR game I have seen so far. I mean, there are a couple of other games out there like Ratchet & Clank and yes, Cyberpunk. Even contrast wise, it can't keep up with this game, but in terms of HDR, Cyberpunk is a great HDR game. Anyway, The Witcher 3, regardless where you play this game, PC, Xbox or PlayStation 5, HDR is top.